Professor, for a very interesting and a very candid talk on this very important subject that we have just discussed. If there's any question from anyone, kindly unmute yourself and do the honor. Or I can probably start just to set the stage for the discussion, sir. Professor, you have started the lecture by talking about the politico-diplomatic assistance given by the US to the Israeli government. Over the last 2.5 months period, there have been lots of write-ups and discussions connecting the breakthrough that we are getting to see in the Arab world with the Israeli government right now. So how far do you think this is going to play out with the American election? Your comment on this, sir.
Frankly, I don't think that the peace agreements in the Middle East will have much of an impact in the United States. Most Americans vote according to their pocket. Their pocket shows that they are in better shape than in 4 years ago. But of course, the main issue is COVID-19, and it seems to most observers, that Mr. Trump has not done a great job in dealing with this issue. So I don't know what the Middle East process is not on the main agenda of the voters, and not even on the Jewish voters. The Jewish voters, Israel is not necessarily their number one, issue of concern. Of course, it's nice to have this type of ceremonies. He gets attention from the press; they cannot ignore it. But I think that the critical issue will be law and order. To what extent, particularly what happened in the recent days in Philadelphia, will create greater concern about law and order, and this is good for Trump. If Corona issue remains the most important issue, that's good for Biden. So we don't know. I don't know what will, Middle East is definitely not the main issue. I would like also to point out something I forgot. Our military assistance, $3.8 billion was initiated in the Obama era. Even, a president that was quite critical about Israel, he wanted to have a daylight between us and him. 3 point, it's a lot of money, even for the Americans.
Thank you, sir. With us, please.
Thank you, Professor. I think that was a very candid, discussion, and you talked a lot about the impact on the U.S.-Israel relations and Middle East and everything. And you referred to very briefly about the possible impact of the Biden administration in Israeli politics. So would you like to elaborate on that a bit?
Biden is a well-known figure in Israel because he's spent so much time in the Senate, and he visited many times. I also met him at King David, some dinner organized by the American embassy. He has good appetite, and people feel comfortable with Biden. Some Israelis look at American politics and, this is the best what America has to offer. It's a question mark. But Biden is there. By the way, he's much more respected than Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton had although she was a senator from New York, and of course, being from New York, she had to, well, there is a huge Jewish concentration. He had to deal with Jews and with Israel, but she has been always suspected of being, pro-Palestinian. With Biden, we don't have this fear, And for us, it's like, a football game, who wins, it's, we are not that concerned, it's, of course, like Trump, okay, we'll be happy. But if Biden, fine, we'll accommodate ourselves.
Professor, we have a question from Mr. Brijeshwar Dahiya. The question for him is, what would be the position of upcoming US administration, be it new or old, on Chinese investment in Israel?
I think, again, there is no big difference between Trump and the Democratic administration. Both administrations will be very cautious about Chinese investments. The Trump administration was more vocal about it. And, Pompeo came to Jerusalem and made it quite clear that this is an American position. And we went along. Of course, Chinese money is attractive. The opportunities, business opportunities in China are attractive. But if the Americans insist, we will do what Washington wants us from us, because after all, Washington is more important to us than Beijing.
Thank you, sir. So we have another question from...
There is, by the way, also a growing awareness in Israel of dangers of Chinese investments into Israeli infrastructures. That's quite clear.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Sid, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Professor the question?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Professor Inbar, for this wonderful address. My question to you was, do you believe that Biden's views on Iran would have changed from his previous stint in the White House? And this is particularly concerning the fact that Iran has continued to remain resilient, despite the fact that there's been a particularly hostile administration in the White House in tenure at the moment.
I think Biden was critical of the elimination of Soleimani. The Democrats are more vegetarian than the Republicans. And this, of course, affects, the willingness of the Biden administration to use force against Iran. And they may also buy the narratives that, you have to give them carrots in order, to bring them to the negotiating table. So we may see, a more less, antagonistic position toward Iran. But if, but this could happen also with Trump. Trump is a businessman. He wanted to talk to Iranian leaders when they were in New York for United Nations General Assembly, and they refused to meet. So he met North Korean, this crazy guy. So, it's, he'll meet all the mullahs, ayatollahs, whatever it needs to get a deal. He wants a deal. And probably for him, the deal is more important than its details. So in that respect, again, as I mentioned, there is no big difference between a Democratic or a Republican administration after the election on Iran, if they come to the negotiating table. If they don't, of course, Trump, could, use his teeth to bite the Iranians, or use Israeli teeth to do so. We are the only ones that are killing Iranians in the Middle East, after all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So we have another question from Anuradha. Could you please unmute yourself, Anuradha, and ask a question to Professor?
Thank you, sir. So my question is related.
Can I see your face? I know.
Sir, there is a network problem. If I
Okay, fine,
Okay.
fine.
okay, sir. So my question is
When I
that
hear a lady, I always want to see her face.
okay. So the highly polarized Jewish community will be able to make a major change in presidential election, even if Trump succeed in bringing more Jews to the Republican side.
The Jewish community is divided. I wouldn't call it, polarized. There is a continuum. There are not two camps. So there is a continuum of, right-wing Jews, left-wing Jews, and the middle center that, depends on the issue, sympathizes with one side or another side. Don't forget that the dispute is not only over the Palestinian issue, but also on church and state. Many American Jews, particularly if they are of Reformed denomination or conservative to some extent, are very critical of the fact that religion in Israel is more or less monopolized by Orthodox, by the Orthodox stream. And so there are several issues which intersect. So the Jews, will vote, most of them Democratic, but the Jews cooperate. They have cohesive communities, synagogues, community centers, a lot of institutions. So we have, a huge amount of Jewish organizations who, negotiate with each other all the time. They are competing over memberships. They are competing over funds. So it's a very lively community, and usually you can bring everybody into the tent. That's how it's called. The Jewish tent. Everybody usually comes to the tent and is part of it. We have very few groups which are outside of the tent, and that's the price you pay when you have democracy.
Thank you, sir. Sanjay, sir, would you like to pose any question to Professor? Okay, I'll get back to him, sir. So we have another question from Aditya. Aditya, please unmute yourself and.
Hello. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I do.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for the talk. Sir, in the recent time, we have seen a host of normalization deals with Israel and Arab Gulf countries. So how do you evaluate President Trump's role in these normalization process, as he made a big fanfare about these deals? And sir, what do you expect do you expect if Mr. Biden wins, do you expect the same level of enthusiasm when it comes to normalization in the Arab world? Thank you, sir.
First of all, the involvement of the United States was very high. They sent Jared Kushner, who is a son-in-law of Trump. You speak with a boss if you speak to his son-in-law, if you understand the Arab culture. So it was quite clear that the Americans had a big stake in trying to bring those agreements. I think they did it in a very smart way. They had economic conference in Manama, for example, and they gradually brought in, the government. And we shouldn't forget, which is, very important, that after all, Israel had very lucrative relations with some of those countries under the table. My friend, Eran Lerman, colleague, at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, he said, under the table was very crowded in the Middle East. So it is almost a natural result, which the Americans, I think were central to bring to fruition, those processes. Will Biden administration continue? It's, the easy part is behind us. So now it's much more difficult to convince the Saudis or Qataris or, Kuwait. Kuwait is very pro-Palestinian. So to do the same. So I'm not sure that, they can do it. Also, I don't know, the Biden's son is busy in other parts of the world. So I don't know that, I don't think that the new administration will put the same effort. And don't forget that each administration, particularly at the beginning, tries to make sure that, the appointments are in place and is busy with the domestic affairs, stabilizing the rule over the system. And afterwards, have time for foreign policy initiatives. And, China, after all, is also, an important issue, and it continues to be an issue.
Thank you, sir. Professor Tanaka, would you like to pose a question to Professor Inbar? Okay, sir, I'll come to him, sir, again. So we have another query from Mr. Borse. Mr. Borse, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Professor the question. I will ask, on behalf of Mr. Borse, I'll ask this question, Professor Inbar. The question he raises is India-Israel-USA strategic triangle best balance of power options in Chinese military strategy?
What is the question? If there will be what triangle?
Is India-Israel-USA strategic triangle best balance of power options in Chinese military strategy?
Well, I think that it's not just a trilateral. After all, you have a quad also. And the regional Asian powers, Japan, Australia, and this, those countries are closer to the southern Chinese Sea or to the Pacific region. But what is interesting, and not always people pay attention, we do arm all of China's rivals. Vietnam, Japan, Australia, Thailand. So, of course, there is an ongoing cooperation, which you wrote a lot about, Alvite, with Israel, between India and Israel. So we are part of this alignment, and I'm sure the Chinese don't like it, but that's life. So we do what's best for us, and I wouldn't, put it just a trilateral. I think that the Chinese challenge to regional stability is so great that closer countries are much more involved. And of course, you need American leadership for that. In this respect, I must say that Trump picked up the issue and aggressively. And I don't know if Biden will do the same. But it's definitely not only Indian, American, Israeli trilateral vis-a-vis China. It's much larger.
Right. Samina ma'am, would you like to ask any question to sir? Okay, I'll go to the next gentleman. Pratmesh, if you can unmute yourself and ask Professor your question.
Hi, thank you. President Obama advocated a return to the pre-1967 borders, and VP Biden was served under him. So how can Israelis still trust Biden, knowing fully well that the previous administration tried to make Israel pull back from the annexation part as well? That was my question. Thank you.
Well, first of all, we don't know, but I don't think it's possible really to pressure Israel to go back to 67 borders. This is something that is not realistic. And I think more and more countries, including the United States, and maybe primarily the United States under Trump, realize it. Don't forget that there is a Trump plan on the table, which allows Israel to annex parts of the Judea and Samaria. And there was even an American-Israeli group working on the map. So it's, I don't think that the Americans, there is also a Bush letter, recognizing facts on the ground. So I don't think the Americans are aiming at bringing or pressuring Israel to go to the 67 borders. We can always call election if the pressure is too strong, so we gain a few months and who knows what will happen. And so this is not in the cards. And I think Biden fully understands that Israel under Netanyahu was not to be blamed for the impasse in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Actually, March 2014, President Obama presented a plan to Netanyahu. And Netanyahu answered, I'm ready to negotiate on the basis of this plan with the Palestinians. Go to the Palestinians, ask them if they are ready to negotiate according to this plan. And Abu Mazen went to Washington, talked to Obama, and told him, I'll give you an answer. We are still waiting for the answer. So it's quite clear, even to the most, pro-Palestinian, serious Americans, that the Palestinians have missed tremendous opportunities. We hear it from the South. I don't know if you paid attention. Prince Bandar just said a few weeks ago, using a term of Abba Eban, the Palestinian never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And it's tragic. It's tragic for them. It's also tragic for us. I wish we can come up with some kind of, reasonable compromise. Reasonable, of course, in my eyes, I admit. But their demands are totally unacceptable. They are so unrealistic in their political behavior. Look how they treated, President Bush. Abu Mazen called him kalb, dog. That's not, very diplomatic language. So they estranged this administration, and they may estrange even the next administration. We are not worried about that. Not even with Obama. Obama didn't try to push Israel back to 67 borders. There were changes, and there was military presence in the Jordan Valley. And of course, the Trump plan, which is basically supported by the Arab countries, openly or tacitly, speaks about for itself. It's an entirely different atmosphere, and also with a lot of caveats about a Palestinian state. I want to say shalom, hello to Joseph Kitchian. Hi, how are you? It's good to see you in the audience. We are friends, I met him first at Rand many years ago.
Sorry to be late.
In Saudi Arabia now, I believe, yes.
Thank you, sir. Professor Joseph, would you like to pose a question to Professor Inbar?
Well, since I missed the beginning of the talk, I'd rather listen to it, and I promise to you, Efraim, that I will take the tape from Kumar Aswami and listen to it. I just had something else to do, and I apologize for being late. But I'm sure the talk was fantastic, because I know Efraim Inbar for a long time. I've known him from the days when I used to be at the Rand Corporation, and he used to come and visit me and take my brain apart. but he looks good.
Oh, thank you. White hair.
So would you like to ask a question to Professor Inbar?
Switched off the mic. Okay. Sorry, Efraim. If you look at it, one of the strengths of the Israel-US relation is the bipartisan support, both in the Senate, in the Congress, in the House, as well as towards the president. This is often visible before the election. In normal circumstances, both the candidates will come to Israel in some form or the other, especially during the run-up to the vote, because we couldn't do it due to COVID. But what was interesting was Netanyahu did not even speak to Biden after his nomination. And that probably, I understand is it because of he thought such a course would be seen as an unfriendly act? Because if you remember, when President Trump spoke to Netanyahu about Sudan, he was actually asking him, do you think that a sleepy Joe would have done this? And Netanyahu answered it rather diplomatically. Any American help is welcome to us. You have done a lot to us. So, he was not willing to be trapped by this. But when you look at it, knowingly or unknowingly, as Netanyahu broke the bipartisan approach towards Israel.
I don't think he dropped the bipartisan approach. Don't forget that there is a change of reality in the United States. The United States is in itself much more polarized. And with this type of reality and with his natural inclinations, he, as I mentioned, he has indicated his support for, in many ways, for a Republican candidate. This has to be corrected. This has to be corrected. I don't know if he spoke with Biden privately. Maybe he did. Maybe it was a mistake on part of Prime Minister Netanyahu to ignore Biden in such a way. But every prime minister has some weaknesses. Nobody is perfect.
Okay, are there any more questions? If not, then I can again move on to Mudassir. He had a question again. Mudassir, could you just unmute yourself and ask Professor the question?
Sorry to come back again. No. Partly I was asking the same point about which Sir already asked about Netanyahu breaking the bipartisan support. But one of the things which I was also looking for is how will the change in White House or even continuity in White House affect the domestic politics in Israel? Will there be any impact, especially if there is a change in the White House? Will that have an impact in the domestic politics in Israel?
For Israelis, the support America is very important. I think that the electoral victory of Yitzhak Rabin in 1992 was partly, and I emphasize, partly a result of the perceptions that his rival, Yitzhak Shamir, has tense relationship with the White House. So there is always an American factor in Israeli politics, but in the last 4 years, it was a honeymoon with the president. With Obama, it was different, of course, but still, I think Obama made a huge mistake vis-a-vis the Israelis. In his first trip to the Middle East, he omitted Israel. He was very cool to the Israelis instead of embracing them. And therefore, the position of Netanyahu against Obama, primarily on the Iranian issue, which commands the consensus of many Israelis, was seen as reasonable. Not everybody was happy with Netanyahu going to Congress and speaking against the deal and against the president, but people could understand that this is reasonable. This is has some rationale, and therefore he didn't pay for it afterwards in the electoral, in our elections. But definitely having relations, good relations with America is more important than having good relations with Cairo, with Amman, or with, for us, we look to America.
Thank you, sir. Is there anybody else who would like to pose any question to sir, to Professor Inbar? Please raise your hand. We can go for another few minutes if you want to, or sir, what do you say?
Both will end it.
All right, sir. All right. So, thank you, Professor Inbar, for a very delightful discussion we had today. It's always a pleasure listening to you, your perspectives on this issue, which you have seen from a very, very close angle. And I'm sure all of us in this virtual room will have something or the other to take back, along with us the moment we leave the room and see the entire game which is going on in the US as well as in Israel from a very different perspective, clubbed together with some of your points that you have just spoken about, sir. It's my pleasure, sir, to have moderated your session, and I look forward to meeting you again. And with these few words, I hand over the floor to Professor.
Oh, thank you.